Ringo Starr built his public image on warmth. The peace signs, the easy grin, the peace and love sign-off. For 6 decades, he's been the Beatle nobody could stay angry at. But underneath that geniality sits a genuinely turbulent history. A childhood spent fighting for his life, a drummer's seat he had to fight to keep, and a band that nearly fell apart around him more than once. Of everyone who tested Ringo's patience over the years, bandmates included, one outsider did more lasting damage to the group he loved than anybody else. This is the real story of how Ringo Starr got there. Ringo Starr was born Richard Starkey in July 1940, in a working-class stretch of Liverpool called the Dingle, during the middle of the Second World War. His early years were defined less by music than by illness. At the age of 6, he was hospitalized with a burst appendix and peritonitis, an infection serious enough that he was not expected to survive it. He fell into a coma during the ordeal and spent close to a year recovering in hospital, missing so much school that he fell badly behind his classmates. Then, in his early teens, he was struck by tuberculosis and confined to a sanatorium for roughly 2 more years. Between the 2 illnesses, Starkey missed the majority of his formal education. He later said he left school essentially unable to read or write properly, and that sense of having missed out, of being behind everyone else before he'd even started, stayed with him. It was during his stay in the sanatorium that hospital staff encouraged patients to play in a small band, and Starkey was handed a drum. That accident of convalescence is the reason the most famous drummer in rock history ever picked up sticks at all. By his late teens, he was playing with local Liverpool skiffle and rock groups, eventually landing the drum stool in Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, one of the most popular acts on the Merseyside club circuit, arguably, for a stretch, more popular than the Beatles themselves. Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were a slicker, more polished outfit than the scruffier Beatles of the same period, and Starr, going by the stage name Ringo Starr even then, developed a reputation as the most reliable timekeeper working the Liverpool and Hamburg club circuits. Musicians who played alongside him in those years remembered him as unshowy but rock-solid, the drummer other bands wished they had. That reputation is what first put him on the Beatles' radar. The 2 bands crossed paths repeatedly in Hamburg's Reeperbahn clubs in the early 1960s, and Starr occasionally sat in for the Beatles' own drummer, Pete Best, when Best was unavailable. Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison liked what they heard, and they liked Starr personally. He fit easily into the band's sense of humor and camaraderie in a way that mattered to 3 men who had grown up together and were naturally wary of outsiders. But even that early familiarity didn't spare him from becoming, almost immediately, the member the band had to defend. By the summer of 1962, the Beatles had a recording contract with EMI, but a drummer, Pete Best, whom producer George Martin wasn't enthusiastic about. On August 16, 1962, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison made the decision to fire Best and bring in Starr, whom they already knew and liked from the Hamburg and Liverpool club scenes. Fans who had adored Best were furious. There were protests outside the Cavern Club, and Starr stepped into a lineup that was, from day one, defensive of a drummer they didn't choose. Worse, the band's own producer didn't yet trust him either. When the Beatles went into Abbey Road on September 4, 1962, to record Love Me Do, with Starr behind the kit, George Martin was unsatisfied with the results. A week later, or a session dedicated to nailing the single, Martin brought in a seasoned session player named Andy White and had him play drums on both Love Me Do and its B-side, P.S. I Love You, while Starr was handed a tambourine and maracas instead. It was White's version of Love Me Do that ended up on the Beatles' debut album. Starr later recalled being mortified by the whole episode, and Martin himself admitted years afterward that he felt for him in the moment. Martin did eventually warm to Starr's playing, and the 2 became genuinely friendly. Martin would later credit Starr with a distinctive, deep drum tone that suited the band's records, and White was only brought back in for the Beatles' work on rare occasions after that. But the message of that first proper session, that the newest Beatle wasn't fully trusted yet, was not lost on Starr, and it echoed a pattern that would recur throughout his time in the band. Being the member whose place felt the most conditional. The Best fallout compounded it. Even years later, some fans and journalists floated the theory that Starr's version of Love Me Do, not White's, had been the one used on the album, and that the credit had simply gone unnoticed. A small, telling detail about how little attention was paid to sorting out which drummer actually played on the band's breakthrough single. Starr, for his part, rarely dwelled publicly on the slight. He has spoken instead, over the decades, about how quickly the Beatles' own success made the question irrelevant. Within a year of that September 1962 session, the band was the biggest act in Britain, and within 2 years, the biggest in the world. Once the lineup was set, Starr's actual role in the band settled into something the press consistently undersold. He wasn't a songwriter in the way Lennon and McCartney were, and he wrote far less than Harrison, but he became, by most accounts from people who worked with the band, one of its steadying forces, both musically and personally. Producers and engineers who worked at Abbey Road during the mid-1960s frequently pointed to Starr's timekeeping and feel as central to records that depended on a loose, human-sounding rhythm section, from Rain to A Day in the Life. His drumming on Rain, in particular, is still cited by drummers as some of the most inventive rock playing of the decade, built in part around a backwards tape effect the band experimented with in the studio. Off the stage, Starr's role was different, but no less important. Touring during the peak of Beatlemania, from 1963 through the band's final live show in 1966, was chaotic and exhausting. Screaming crowds drowned out the music entirely. Hotel rooms were besieged, and the four of them were often confined together for days at a stretch. Multiple band members and associates later described Starr as the one who defused tension during those stretches, the least likely of the four to escalate an argument. It's a role that rarely gets remembered in retrospectives built around the band's genius songwriters, but it shaped how the other three depended on him, quietly, for years. Financially and creatively, though, Starr was also the member with the least leverage. He received a smaller royalty share than Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison in the band's early contracts, an arrangement that wasn't renegotiated until later in the decade, and he had comparatively little say over the band's musical direction once Lennon and McCartney began asserting themselves as the group's primary songwriters. That imbalance, more than any single insult, is part of what made him sensitive to moments where his place in the band felt provisional. Moments like the Andy White session and, later, the White Album walkout. By 1968, the Beatles were recording what would become their self-titled double album, now universally known as the White Album, and the sessions were some of the most fractured of the band's career. The group had just returned from a retreat in India that was supposed to bring them closer together. Instead, old tensions resurfaced almost immediately. Yoko Ono's constant presence at John Lennon's side in the studio unsettled the working dynamic the other three were used to, and recording increasingly splintered into each Beatle working on his own songs with the others as session musicians rather than true collaborators. Starr felt the strain more than most. During the sessions for Back in the USSR, in August 1968, after friction with Paul McCartney over his drumming and a mounting sense that he didn't belong in a band that suddenly felt like three tight units plus himself, Starr walked out. He went first to Lennon's flat and told him plainly that he was leaving because he felt he wasn't playing well and felt shut out while the other three seemed close. Lennon's reply, by Starr's own account, was that he felt exactly the same way about being on the outside. Starr repeated the conversation at McCartney's house, then collected his family and left for a holiday in Sardinia, borrowing a yacht from his friend, the actor Peter Sellers. The band went on working without him. McCartney sat behind the kit himself to finish Back in the USSR, with Lennon on bass, producing a session that, however well-intentioned, could only have reinforced Starr's fear that he was replaceable. Producer George Martin later reflected that Starr's exit felt like walking into a marital row and wondering if your presence was making things worse, and suspected Starr may have quietly wondered whether he himself was the problem. The other three eventually sent flowers to welcome him back, and after roughly 2 weeks away, Starr returned to the studio to find his kit decorated with flowers spelling out a welcome back message. The band completed the album, and one of the songs Starr wrote during his time away, Octopus's Garden, ended up on the following year's Abbey Road. The rupture healed on the surface, but it marked the first time a Beatle had actually walked out of the band entirely, and it exposed just how conditional Starr had come to feel his membership was, a feeling that would resurface, far more consequentially, within a year. It's also worth noting how the other three responded, because it says something about where Starr actually stood with his bandmates, whatever his private doubts. None of them treated his departure as good riddance. McCartney later described the period around the White Album as one of the tensest of the band's career, acknowledging that the group was close to falling apart even as they worked. Lennon, reflecting on the album years afterward, said plainly that the coming breakup of the band could be heard on that record. Starr's walkout wasn't the cause of that tension so much as a symptom of it, a sign of just how strained the four-way partnership had become by 1968, 2 years before it ended for good. The deeper wound in Starr's Beatles years didn't come from a bandmate at all. It came from the collapse of the band's business affairs after their manager, Brian Epstein, died of an accidental overdose in August 1967. Epstein had run the Beatles' finances and their day-to-day decisions almost single-handedly. Without him, the group's business empire, Apple Corps, spiraled into disorganization, and by 1969 the band's money was disappearing through mismanagement and excess. Into that vacuum stepped Alan Klein, an aggressive, self-made American businessman who had already built a reputation managing acts like Sam Cooke and the Rolling Stones by aggressively renegotiating their old contracts and recovering royalties they were owed. Klein had made his name in the early 1960s as an accountant who specialized in auditing record labels on behalf of artists, frequently uncovering money labels owed musicians and then taking them on as management clients once he'd proven he could get results. That track record earned him a reputation in the industry as someone who could be trusted to fight for artists against the corporate side of the business, and also, among the labels and executives he went after, a reputation as someone to be feared. By the time he approached the Beatles, he had already managed the Rolling Stones' business affairs for several years, a relationship that would itself end in prolonged litigation once the Stones parted ways with him in 1970. Klein approached John Lennon directly after reading a comment Lennon made in the press about the Beatles being close to broke, and Lennon was won over almost immediately. George Harrison followed, drawn in part to what he described as Klein's working-class, street, demeanor, which felt more familiar to musicians from Liverpool than the polished East Coast lawyer Paul McCartney was pushing for instead. Starr, exhausted by the chaos and eager for someone to simply take charge, went along with Lennon and Harrison. His own recollection of first meeting Klein was blunt. He described his first impression as brash. He remembered Klein's energy fondly at the time, describing him as enthusiastic and likable in an unmistakably brash New York way. McCartney refused to sign. He wanted his new father-in-law's business associates handling the Beatles' affairs instead, and when he was outvoted 3-1 on the choice of manager, the disagreement calcified into one of the defining fractures of the group's final years. Every business decision from that point forward became a 3-1 vote, with Klein positioned at the center of it, managing the money and, in the process, managing the divide. Klein did deliver, at least at first. He renegotiated the Beatles' royalty rate with EMI and recovered money the band was owed. But cracks appeared quickly. Klein's oversight of the 1971 concert for Bangladesh, the landmark charity event George Harrison organized, became a serious embarrassment. Reporting later revealed that a portion of the proceeds meant for famine relief hadn't reached the intended charity for years, and Klein was found to have taken a disproportionate cut of the live album's profits. Around the same time, it emerged that Klein had been collecting a 20% commission not just on new revenue he generated for the band, as originally promised, but on their entire royalty stream, a discrepancy that alarmed all three of the Beatles who had signed with him. By early 1973, Lennon, Harrison, and Starr had all had enough, and the three of them jointly declined to renew Klein's management contract when it expired that spring. Litigation followed in both directions, with Klein suing the band and the band suing back, a dispute that dragged on for years before it was finally settled out of court in 1977. In 1979, Klein was convicted of tax evasion connected to his handling of unreported income from unauthorized sales of concert for Bangladesh albums, and served time in prison. What made the Klein years especially painful in hindsight wasn't just the money. It was the way his presence had hardened the band's internal split during the very period when they might have found a way back to each other. George Harrison later said, of the prospect of a full Beatles reunion, that it could only happen once Klein was entirely out of the picture, and that by the time that condition was finally met, in the years after 1973, the moment for a genuine reunion had already passed. Starr, for his part, told the press in early 1973 that he saw hardly any chance of the group performing together again, even as he insisted the four of them remained on good terms personally. The Beatles' breakup was made public by Paul McCartney in April 1970, though John Lennon had privately told the others he was leaving the group the previous September. For Starr, the years that followed were harder than the split itself. He continued working steadily. His early solo albums, including 1970's Sentimental Journey and Beaucoup of Blues, sold reasonably well, and singles like It Don't Come Easy and Photograph gave him genuine hits independent of the band. But by his own account, the emotional toll of the breakup and the drawn-out Klein litigation caught up with him through the 1970s and into the 1980s. Starr has said openly in later interviews that he was, in his words, mad for roughly 20 years after the split, and that entire stretches of that period are hard for him to remember clearly because of how heavily he was drinking. That drinking became a genuine crisis by the mid-1980s. Starr has described losing years to alcohol and drug use during that period, and by 1988 he and his wife, actress Barbara Bach, both recognized they needed help and entered treatment together. Starr has said the decision came after a night of drinking ended with him waking up to find his own home in disarray, and that roughly a week into treatment something shifted in how he understood himself. He came out of rehab and, within about a year, formed the first lineup of his all-star band, a rotating group of well-known musicians that has toured under his name in various configurations ever since. Starr has repeatedly credited sobriety with giving him back the energy and stability that fame and grief had eaten into for 2 decades, and he has now spoken publicly about being sober for more than 3.5 decades. The Klein saga's shadow lingered longest, though, in the band's chances of ever fully reconciling. George Harrison's comment that a real Beatles reunion could only happen with Klein entirely out of the picture reflected just how central the dispute had become to the group's internal politics. Not a creative disagreement, but a legal and financial one that took years to unwind even after the four men had stopped being angry at each other personally. By the time the litigation was finally settled in 1977, Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr had all moved into separate solo careers, families, and lives, and whatever window existed for the four of them to work together again as a band had effectively closed. John Lennon's murder in December 1980 closed it permanently. Even so, the surviving relationships among the 3 remaining Beatles stayed warmer than the mythology of a permanently fractured band suggests. Starr and Harrison worked together repeatedly through the 1970s, and Starr contributed drums to several of McCartney's solo records over the following decades as well. In 2015, it was McCartney himself who inducted Starr into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, delivering a speech that reflected on their decades of friction and friendship together. The two have continued to appear together publicly in the years since, including contributing to each other's more recent projects. A far cry from the version of events in which Starr is imagined nursing private grudges against his old bandmates for the rest of his life. It's worth being direct about something here. Plenty of retellings of this story lean on the idea that Starr harbored deep, secret resentment toward George Harrison specifically, imagining a slow-burning betrayal built around sessions like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, where Harrison brought in his friend Eric Clapton to play lead guitar rather than relying solely on his bandmates. That's a real historical moment. Clapton's solo on that track is well documented, but the picture of Harrison and Starr drifting into cold silence over it doesn't hold up against the two men's actual history. Starr played drums on Harrison's All Things Must Pass sessions in 1970 and performed at the concert for Bangladesh alongside him in 1971. The two remained close collaborators and friends for the rest of Harrison's life, and Starr has spoken warmly and consistently about their bond in interview after interview. The genuinely corrosive relationship in this story wasn't between bandmates at all. It was with the manager both of them, along with Lennon, chose to trust. The same caution applies to some of the color used in retellings involving Peter Sellers, Mick Jagger, or Keith Moon. Sellers, in reality, was a close friend Starr turned to for support. He's the one who lent Starr his yacht for the 1968 getaway to Sardinia, and the two later worked together on The Magic Christian in 1969, painting him